I recently stumbled upon this paper written by Jackson and Winston discussing about the taboos, real or perceived, on the topic of intelligence and race. The paper chronicled the psychologists who believe that intelligence is inherited along with race. The paper itself intends to address the problems hereditarians brought up extensively, that their science is getting censored, that their research is unfunded because of ideological taboos, and that judgments on their science is unfair and biased. I'd like to talk a little bit about the hereditarians and their endeavors. Much of this video is based on the paper. I highly recommend you to check it out in full. Before we jump to talks of race and racism, let me talk a bit about IQ testing. IQ testing is sound and grounded on solid scientific framework. Intelligence is formulated as cognitive abilities, and test measures this by pushing one's abilities to the limit. Intelligence consists of multiple levels at different specificity. The most elementary is the G factor, the broadest and least specific ability. The outer layers consist of a wide range of cognitive abilities, some at a very specific level. Intelligence is correlated with tangible outcomes like job performance. IQ testing is also important to diagnose certain mental disorders. Hence, whether or not intelligence is inherited have serious implications. It's not just used to see how smart you are. However, it is equally important to understand the limitations of IQ as a predictor of positive outcomes. Intelligence is not an everything or nothing variable, as humans are very complex. Cognitive abilities as measured by IQ do not determine everything. The idea is to understand both the importance and limitations of human intelligence testing. It is a nuanced picture, and not one to carelessly overemphasize or undermine. So, given its importance, hereditarians tend to contextualize their findings under broader educational goals. A notable example is prominent psychologist Arthur Jensen, who drew controversy in 1969. He argued that intelligence is inherited and thus has a racial basis, and because American education is blind to this post-racial difference, billions of dollars were wasted in government investment to useless Head Start programs. Jensen remains a notable figure in advocating for the race and IQ association. His case was a wild one. Public outrage made him subject to threats of physical violence, so harsh that one time the police secured him not to stay in his own home for his own safety. Intelligence is unquestionably inherited. The debates concern the extent of this and whether IQ can be increased with interventions. Here, when I say hereditary views, I mean the extreme emphasis on genetic and often racial determinism that some researchers place. Heredity and IQ research analyze the proportion of variance in IQ attributed to heredity. They typically present their ideas in concrete numerical estimates. The estimates range around 20%, 50%, or 80% of intelligence to be due to heredity. It should be noted that the hereditary view of intelligence is not mainstream among intelligence researchers. Individuals like Jensen remain on the fringe of psychology. Their arguments fall short for many reasons, which I will discuss a few of them. Race in race and intelligence research are defined dubiously. An example of this is a researcher who claimed that self-identification of participants to a particular race is sufficient to generalize their findings to genetic race. This is not acceptable to geneticists. In whose view, it is necessary to rigorously check whether samples of participants do group together in a single breeding population. There is little evidence to this for both black and white participants tested in many IQ research. Heritability is also not malleability. Highly inherited traits may be very easily changed by things like education. If racial differences of intelligence do exist, inferring educational significance without considering malleability is faulty reasoning. Intelligence is described as having very high heritability, but also very high malleability. Furthermore, given that genes interact continuously with the environment, some views doubt whether the strict separation of genes and the environment is appropriate at all. This is also the view of eminent statistician and geneticist Oscar Camthorne. He illustrated this in a hypothetical 2x2 table. The columns are a hypothetical environment and the rows a hypothetical gene. Here, causality is a joint force of gene and environment. Camthorne argued that the partition of variance in intelligence which hereditarian research used to infer causality, are faulty. Evidence from statistical analysis alone that said some percent of intelligence to be due to heredity cannot be interpreted causally. His criticisms are more fully fleshed out in his 23-page paper. His arguments are more nuanced than this brief summary. However, I believe this quote of him represents his general feeling to the debate. I have the view that the hereditarians are utterly naive. It is obvious that parental IQ influences offspring environment. It is obvious that there is cultural transmission. To ignore the existence of this is merely stupid. I see no point in mincing words. Hereditarians claim that many race in IQ research and researchers are censored. Hereditarian views are claimed to cause researchers' employment and unfairly censored by the publishing press. How true is this? First, it's not the case that their work is unfairly censored, as books and articles promoting their view manage to be published. Controversial as they are, the fact that they secure platforms to gain considerable attention is evidence against this claim. There is no convincing case that academics are censored and denounced for hereditarian science. In fact, notable people like Hans Eysenck, who was very prominent in personality research in the 80s, retain eminent status as a scientist even today. Second, on employment, some hereditarians claim that many people are fired for simply holding dissenting scientific views. They sum this up in their paper, which concludes that severe reactions to hereditarians have blown up in recent years. Upon further inspection by Jackson and Winston, many of their sources were dubious. For example, they misrepresent the firing of Alessandra Strumia, a CERN scientist, for sexist comments as because of supporting a hereditarian view. Another example is James Watson, Chancellor of Cold Spring Harbor Biological Laboratory. He said that black employees, because of poorer inherited intelligence, are inferior workers. This remark got him fired. While this may appear to be censorship of science, Jackson and Winston made a fair point, that the ceremonial position of Chancellor, a public face for a scientific laboratory, should not be filled by someone who openly questions whether black people are suitable employees there. The authors also ignored incidents where people who endorsed an equal view of intelligence were harassed and censured. This was the case during the American Civil Rights Movement, where those claiming racial intellectual equality are deemed communists. I will repeat that hereditarian views on race and intelligence is not supported by mainstream science. However, hereditarians have campaigned hard that it becomes so. Notably were their efforts to prove that their views are the consensus of scientists. In 1998, intelligence researcher Linda Cuthbertson contacted Wall Street Journal. She offered to write an essay to dispel misinformation about intelligence. They declined, but would accept a document signed by researchers on what facts are part of mainstream intelligence science. The document contains, as you might guess, a list of hereditarian views. Cuthbertson herself was a hereditarian. She praised the bell curve and claimed that many of its criticisms published to the public are misinformation. She proceeds to send her list, which was asserted to be facts that represent the mainstream, to 131 academics. From those 131, 100 responses were obtained. Of the 100 that responded, only 51 agree that the document represents the mainstream view. To her credit, she had sent her list to academics with varying views, which includes those she was sure would sign to those she was sure would not. But this does not stop her from stating that psychologists agree that the views are mainstream. She stated that the press had ridiculed their views and intended to show that the hotly debated hereditarian views were, in effect, mainstream science. While many in the hereditarian community cry foul that their work is unfairly evaluated and their views censored, citing ideological basis, many people who promoted their views participate in or is connected with racism and eugenics. An interesting case was William Shockley. Shockley was an electrical engineer and won a Nobel Prize in Physics in 1956. However, his career took a turn when he decides to advocate for eugenics. He proposed that people with an IQ below 100 should be paid to voluntarily sterilize themselves. Following his sharp turn, he received a lot of bad press. It culminated to him suing a local newspaper, the Atlanta Constitution, for calling him a Nazi. He won the case, and the jury warranted him to be paid $1 in damages, which was all his reputation worth at the time. Consider also the anthropologist and far-right activist Roger Pearson. Pearson viewed different races as a subspecies in progress. He advocated against miscegenation, arguing that it amounts to detrimental interbreeding. Pearson wrote the book Race, Intelligence, and Bias in Academic. There he argued that hereditary scientists are suppressed. He was also a founder and later editor of Mankind Quarterly, a notorious journal that promotes white supremacy and scientific racism. Pearson was connected with psychologists who endorsed the hereditarian view. For example, the foreword of his book was written by none other than Hans Eysenck, and he received a private correspondence from Arthur Jensen praising the book. But these people are not psychologists. Perhaps it is just correct science being misused. Aren't the psychologists themselves racist? Arthur Jensen and his admirers insist that what he does is purely science. But Jensen himself do not shy in using the word eugenic, as he proposed that public policy needs to be so. He was also an editor to the journal New Anthropology. It publishes pieces of racist science and is closely associated with neo-Nazis in the editorial board. Those who advocated for the hereditarian view include not only racist individuals but also institutions. Numerous researches on race IQ associations are funded by the non-profit Pioneer Fund. The fund itself was founded in 1937 with a clear Nazi ideology with the idea of race betterment. Their track record is reflective. Among other things, they distributed Nazi propaganda of eugenics after the war, funded opposition to desegregation during the civil rights movement, and was led by several eugenicists. Prominent advocates of the racial inferiority view, like Arthur Jensen, Roger Pearson, and Hans Eysenck, received millions in research funding. Another recipient of funding was Philip Rushton, who headed the fund from 2002 to 2012. Many proponents of the hereditarian view claim that opposition to their science is politically motivated dogma, but it is quite clear that many, though perhaps not all, advocates are associated with racist views, if not personally connected with races. Rushton and Jensen, in one of their papers, accused their opposition to committing moralistic fallacy. But when researchers who promote this view are well connected to and funded by racist institutions, it's hard to take their argument in good faith. Scientific racism is a long-standing issue. It goes well beyond intelligence testing. Eugenics was coined by Francis Galton in 1883. It would become a significant part of the Western intellectual sphere of the time, culminating in the Nazi Party's gruesome social policy. While the science on human intelligence itself is sound, it is one subject prone to controversies, debates, and abuse. I should anecdotally say that the modern society has a strange obsession with IQ. Regardless of whether or not it is hereditary, IQ is not an ultimate measure of human worth. And I can't help but feeling that this, at least partially, motivates the scientific racism that comes with its abuse.